My debit card was declined at a gas station on a Tuesday morning over a purchase of $11. I remember standing there running it twice, genuinely confused because I knew for a fact there was over $40,000 in that account, money I had earned, saved, and protected for 6 years, ever since my husband and I opened it together as our someday house fund. I logged into the app in the parking lot. Access denied. I called the bank's automated line. Account restricted pending in-branch verification. I didn't panic in the way you might expect. I got very, very calm. I called my husband. He didn't pick up. I looked at the clock at 11:40 in the morning and made a decision. I wasn't waiting for him to call back. I wasn't waiting for an explanation. At 2 p.m. sharp, I was standing at the bank in person with my ID, my account history, and a question that was about to unravel 8 months of lies my husband had been telling me. This is that story. Subscribe because it only gets worse from here. Let's get into it. My name is Claire. I'm 34. I met my husband Nathan when I was 28 at a mutual friend's barbecue, and for most of our 6 years together, I would have described our marriage without much hesitation as a genuinely good one, not perfect, but solid, built on the kind of practical, steady partnership I'd always wanted more than some dramatic, sweeping romance. Nathan worked in commercial insurance, a stable if unglamorous career. I worked as a physical therapist, a job I loved that had let me build a steady, reliable income over the years. From almost the beginning of our relationship, we operated with a specific financial philosophy that I'd always felt proud of. Separate personal accounts for day-to-day spending so neither of us had to ask permission for small individual purchases, and one shared joint account, which we both contributed to religiously, specifically earmarked for a down payment on a house. We called it half-jokingly the Someday House Fund, and for 6 years we treated it with a kind of quiet reverence. I contributed $1,200 a month automatically without fail. Nathan contributed roughly the same, sometimes more, during good bonus years at his firm. We didn't touch that account for anything else, not vacations, not emergencies, not even a serious car repair, for 2 years that strained our separate accounts considerably. That fund was sacred, untouchable, the physical representation of a future we were both building toward together. By the time this story starts, that account held just over $41,000, 6 years of disciplined mutual savings, 6 years of a shared goal I genuinely believed both of us were equally invested in. I want to describe briefly what my actual day-to-day life with Nathan looked like in the months leading up to that Tuesday morning, because the contrast between what I believed and what was actually happening matters enormously to this story. We had dinner together most nights. We talked about house listings we liked on weekends, even though we hadn't started seriously looking yet, waiting until we'd agreed, until we hit $50,000 for a more comfortable cushion. Nathan seemed, if anything, slightly more distracted over the preceding several months than usual. Longer hours at work, he said, a demanding new account. He was managing occasional evenings where he seemed distant during dinner, staring at his phone longer than felt entirely normal. I noticed these things. I want to be honest about that. But I didn't interrogate them the way, in hindsight, I probably should have, because 6 years of a genuinely trustworthy partnership had built in me a kind of default faith that I now understand had made me slower to ask hard questions than I might otherwise have been. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I stopped for gas on my way to an early client appointment, swiped my card for $11, and watched it decline. I ran the card again, assuming a simple glitch. A chip reader issued a temporary hold, something mundane. It declined a second time. I paid with a different card from my personal checking account, thinking little of it beyond mild annoyance, and continued on to my first client appointment, planning to sort out the joint account issue on a break later that morning. During a gap between clients around 10:30, I pulled up the banking app on my phone to check the account directly. What I found stopped me completely. Instead of my normal account dashboard, I got an error message indicating the account required in-branch identity verification before further access could be granted, with no further explanation offered through the app itself. I called the bank's customer service line, and after navigating an automated system for several frustrating minutes, finally reached a representative who informed me carefully, in the measured tone of someone reading from a script designed to avoid liability, that the account had been flagged for a requested access modification 8 days earlier, and that per the modification request my access had been restricted pending verification, though she wasn't able to disclose further specifics over the phone for security reasons. I asked her directly who had requested the modification. She told me she couldn't disclose that information to me over the phone, but that whoever had initiated the change would have needed to be a verified account holder with appropriate identification, meaning functionally, it could only have been Nathan, or me, since we were the two people on that account. I hadn't requested any modification, which meant Nathan had 8 days earlier without saying a single word to me about it. I called him immediately. It went straight to voicemail. I texted him. My card just got declined and the bank says access to our account was restricted 8 days ago. Did you do something to it? Call me. I didn't hear back for nearly 2 hours. 2 hours during which I finished my remaining morning appointments on autopilot, my mind cycling through every possible innocent explanation I could construct, and finding with increasing discomfort that none of them held together particularly well. When Nathan finally called back around 12:30, his voice had a strange, overly casual quality to it that I recognized even in the moment as forced. He said he'd meant to talk to me about it, that there'd been some weird activity on the account he'd wanted to look into first before worrying me that he'd requested a temporary restriction just as a precaution while he sorted it out with the bank. I asked him what kind of weird activity. He vaguely mentioned something about a suspicious login attempt, and said he hadn't wanted to alarm me over what might be nothing. I asked why he hadn't simply told me this 8 days ago when it happened, rather than letting me find out through a declined card at a gas station. He didn't have a good answer. He said he'd been meaning to, that work had been insane, and that he was planning to explain everything this weekend. Something about his tone, not quite what he was saying, but how carefully he seemed to be choosing each word, told me with a clarity I couldn't fully explain at the moment that I wasn't getting the real story. I told him I was going to the bank myself in person to sort it out directly. He said that it wasn't necessary, that he could handle it, that I should let him deal with it since he'd been the one managing the suspicious activity issue. I told him I'd see him that evening, hung up, and looked at the clock. It was 1:45. I had one appointment left ending at 1:30. I canceled it. I want to describe the state I was in during that drive, because it wasn't the panicked, tearful spiral you might expect from someone whose husband had just given her a vague, unconvincing explanation about their shared savings account. It was something quieter, and in its own way more unsettling, a kind of cold, focused clarity, the specific feeling of your body preparing for information your mind hasn't fully let itself process yet. I thought back during that 15-minute drive over the preceding several months, turning over every slightly off moment I'd half noticed and let go. The extra hours at work that had increased noticeably around 4 months earlier. A weekend trip he'd taken for a work conference that I now uncomfortably couldn't quite recall the specific details of when I tried to reconstruct them. A new gym membership he'd mentioned offhand, one that seemed to require considerably more evening hours than seemed typical. I didn't yet have anything concrete. I want to be honest about that. As I drove to the bank, I genuinely didn't know what I was going to find, and some part of me was still holding out for an explanation that made this all a misunderstanding rather than the beginning of something much worse. But I also understood with a clarity that surprised me that I wasn't willing to simply wait until this weekend for Nathan to decide how and when to explain something involving $41,000 of money I had personally faithfully contributed to for 6 years. I arrived at the bank at 1:55, sat in the parking lot for the remaining 5 minutes, gathering my identification and account documents, and walked in at exactly 2 p.m. I asked to speak with a banking specialist about a joint account issue, and after a short wait was brought into a small private office by a woman named Patricia, mid-50s, calm and thorough in a way I found immediately reassuring. I explained the situation. A restriction placed on our joint account 8 days earlier, a vague explanation from my husband, my desire to understand exactly what had happened and why. Patricia verified my identity and confirmed I was indeed a co-owner on the account with full rights, and began walking me through the account's recent activity. I want to walk you through what she found because it unfolded in stages that each landed with their own specific sickening weight. First, the restriction itself. It had indeed been requested by Nathan 8 days earlier in person at this exact branch. The stated reason on the request form, Patricia told me reading carefully, was suspected unauthorized access, the same vague explanation Nathan had given me on the phone. I asked Patricia if she could tell me what had actually prompted that request, whether there had genuinely been suspicious activity or something else. She explained carefully that she could share the account's full transaction history with me, since I was an equal account holder with full rights to that information, and that I could draw my own conclusions. What she pulled up stopped my breath in my chest. Over the preceding 5 months, not 8 days, 5 months, there had been a series of transfers out of our joint savings account, each one between $2,000 and $4,000, moved into an external account I didn't recognize, totaling, when Patricia added them up in front of me, just over $18,000. $18,000 of our $41,000 house fund quietly moved out in pieces small enough, I now understood, to avoid tripping the kind of large transaction alert that might have automatically flagged for both account holders. I asked Patricia whose account the money had been transferred into. She explained that she could see it was an external account not held at this bank, and while she couldn't access details of an account outside their institution, she could confirm the transfers had all been initiated using Nathan's login credentials from his registered device. I sat in that small office staring at a printed transaction history and understood with total sickening clarity that Nathan had been quietly draining our shared savings for 5 months, likely, I realized in that moment, connected to whatever had actually been happening during those unexplained late evenings and the work conference. I couldn't quite reconstruct, and that the suspicious activity, restriction he'd placed on the account 8 days earlier, hadn't been protecting me from some outside threat. It had been protecting himself, buying time, likely, because he'd realized the pattern of transfers was approaching a threshold where I might eventually notice on my own, and he needed to control my access before that happened. I asked Patricia one more question: whether, since I was an equal account holder, I had the right to place my own restrictions on the account going forward, specifically requiring both signatures for any future withdrawal or transfer over a certain amount. She confirmed that I did, and within 20 minutes we'd implemented exactly that, a dual authorization requirement on any transaction over $500 effective immediately that could not be unilaterally reversed by either account holder alone. I left that bank branch at a little after 3 with a printed copy of 5 months of transaction history in my bag, and a clarity about what I needed to do next that I hadn't fully possessed even an hour earlier. I didn't call Nathan on my way home. I wanted to have this conversation in person, and I wanted to have it on my terms with the actual documentation in front of both of us, rather than allow him another opportunity to construct a story over the phone before I had all the facts laid out clearly. He got home around 6, and I could tell almost immediately from the careful, overly bright way he greeted me that he'd been anticipating this conversation and preparing some version of an explanation. I didn't give him room to lead with it. I set the printed transaction history on our kitchen table, laid out clearly 5 months of transfers highlighted, and asked him directly to explain what I was looking at. I watched him go through several visible stages in the span of maybe 30 seconds, an initial attempt at surprise quickly abandoned once he saw the specificity of what I had. A flicker of something that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of someone finally not having to maintain a lie any longer, and then finally something closer to genuine shame. He told me the truth in pieces over the following hour. He had about 6 months earlier gotten involved in an online trading platform, cryptocurrency, primarily alongside some speculative day trading, after a co-worker had shown him some genuinely impressive returns. He'd started small, he said, with money from his personal account, and initially it had actually gone well enough that he'd convinced himself he'd found something real, something that could meaningfully accelerate our house fund timeline if he just scaled it up. He'd started moving money from our joint savings, he admitted, initially telling himself it was temporary, that he'd move it back once his positions paid off, that I'd never even need to know it had been touched. Instead, as these things often do, his losses had mounted faster than his wins, and rather than telling me the truth once things started going badly, he'd made the decision over and over, month after month, to keep trying to trade his way back to even before I ever found out, moving increasingly desperate amounts, chasing losses with more money, digging the hole considerably deeper in the process. The restriction he'd placed on the account 8 days earlier, he admitted, had indeed been about buying time, not because of any suspicious outside activity, but because he'd realized, looking at the account balance himself, that the gap between what should have been there and what actually was had grown large enough that I might notice on any given day, and he'd panicked, restricting access, rather than finally telling me the truth, hoping to find some way to either recover the losses or figure out how to explain everything before I discovered it myself. I asked him the number that mattered most. How much of the $18,000 was actually recoverable? He told me quietly that at current market values, what remained in his trading accounts was worth approximately $6,000, meaning roughly $12,000 of our 6 years of disciplined shared savings had simply evaporated, lost to a series of increasingly desperate trades he'd hidden from me for 5 months. I want to be honest about the days immediately following that conversation because they weren't marked by some single dramatic decision, but by a slow, difficult process of figuring out what I actually wanted to do with a marriage that had in one afternoon revealed itself to contain a 5-month deception I hadn't seen any real sign of. I didn't move out immediately. I didn't file for divorce that week, though I want to be clear that the option was very much on the table in my mind during those first several days. What I did almost immediately was formalize the financial boundaries I'd already begun putting in place at the bank, not just the dual authorization requirement on our joint account, but a broader conversation about full financial transparency going forward, including access to any and all trading or investment accounts Nathan held personal or otherwise, a condition I made non-negotiable if there was going to be any path forward for us at all. I also in those first few days spent a significant amount of time processing something that I think surprised me almost as much as the deception itself. How thoroughly Nathan had been willing to let me continue believing for 5 months that our shared future was intact and on track, rather than face the discomfort of admitting a mistake early when it might have still been manageable. I understood intellectually that shame often drives people toward exactly this kind of escalating concealment. Understanding it didn't make it easier to sit with. Nathan, to his credit, didn't fight the boundaries I set. He agreed to full transparency. He closed the trading accounts entirely, not just paused them, and closed them providing documentation to prove it. He started seeing a therapist specifically to address what had clearly become over those months something closer to a compulsive pattern than a single bad decision. A distinction I found eventually mattered to how I processed everything that had happened. We spent the following several weeks in a kind of careful uncertainty, rebuilding a lot of hard conversations, a lot of moments where trust would flicker and then need to be consciously, deliberately extended again. I won't pretend it was linear or comfortable.
It's been 8 months since that Tuesday at the gas station. I want to be honest that our marriage looks different now than it did before, not necessarily worse in every respect, but undeniably changed by what that day revealed. We're still together, which I know surprises some people when they hear this story, and I understand the surprise. I made that decision carefully, not because I minimized what happened, but because everything Nathan did in the months following the discovery, the immediate full transparency, the genuine therapeutic work, the way he handled every subsequent hard conversation without defensiveness, convinced me that this was a person capable of real accountability, even if it had taken a forced confrontation to get there. Our joint account operates completely differently now. Beyond the dual authorization requirement, we've built in a monthly review, 15 minutes every month, where we go through the account together, no exceptions, a small ritual that has done more for my sense of security than almost anything else we've implemented. The $12,000 we lost is genuinely gone, and I've made peace mostly with the fact that it will simply take longer now to reach our house fund goal. What I haven't made peace with, and don't know that I ever fully will, is the 5 months during which I believed something to be true about my marriage that simply wasn't a specific kind of loss that isn't measured in dollars, and that I don't think fully heals so much as you learn to carry it differently over time. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Financial secrecy in a relationship, even when it starts from a place of genuine shame rather than malice, is its own form of betrayal, one that can quietly unravel months of trust before you ever see it coming. I don't regret going to that bank at 2 p.m. instead of waiting for Nathan to explain things on his own timeline. I think if I had waited, if I had let him control the pace and shape of that explanation, I would have gotten a version of the truth curated to minimize the damage to how he needed me to see him, rather than the full uncomfortable reality I was able to access directly in an hour simply by asserting my equal right to information about an account that had always belonged to both of us. If you've ever found yourself locked out of something, an account, a conversation, a piece of information that you have every legitimate right to access, I hope this story reminds you that you don't need anyone's permission to go find out the truth yourself on your own timeline at your own pace. Sometimes the most important thing you can do isn't wait for someone else to be ready to tell you something. It's simply deciding you're ready to know it. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories about marriage, money, and standing up for the truth. I've got plenty more where this one came from.